Pennsylvania is full of small towns that look peaceful on the surface. Quiet streets, old houses, forests that seem to stretch forever. But behind those calm exteriors are stories that locals whisper about to this day. Stories of underground fires that never stop burning, of families who swear something in their home wasn't human, of a child who stepped off a school bus and vanished without leaving a single footprint, of an embalmed, severed head found in the woods with no name, and of jealousy so twisted it led to one of the most heartbreaking teen murders in the state's history. Tonight, we're diving into 5 of Pennsylvania's most disturbing, true, small-town horror stories. Real events, real people, and real mysteries that still haunt the communities they came from. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and hit the like button. It helps these cases reach more people, and it lets me keep making deep dive episodes like this. And if you want a full standalone video on any one of these stories, let me know in the comments below. Now, let's begin with Centralia, the town that's been burning for over 60 years. If you ever drive through a small, quiet Pennsylvania town, you don't expect the earth beneath your tires to be moving. You don't expect heat rising through the pavement or smoke drifting up from cracks in the ground. And you certainly don't expect to be traveling over a place where the soil itself breathes like a living animal. But that is Centralia, a place where the fire has never stopped burning and where a town slowly disappeared, not because of war, not because of a natural disaster, but because the ground beneath it came alive. The story of Centralia isn't a ghost story, although it has all the ingredients of one. It's not about a monster lurking in the shadows or a legend passed down from frightened locals. It's about something far more unsettling, something real, something ancient, something unstoppable. And it begins not with a bang, but with something as ordinary as a municipal trash fire. The year was 1962. Centralia was just one of many coal towns in Pennsylvania, a place where miners went underground every morning and came home covered in dust. A place where families attended church on Sundays, where kids rode their bikes after school, and where life moved slowly, steadily, predictably. But the ground beneath this peaceful little town was a latticework of abandoned coal mines, tunnels spreading for miles in all directions, forgotten shafts that reached deep into the earth. That, by itself, wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what happened when local officials decided to burn trash in an old pit near the cemetery. It was meant to be simple. A routine cleanup, nothing more, but the fire didn't stay in the pit. It reached a forgotten coal seam, one that connected to the vast underground labyrinth beneath the town. And coal, once ignited, is not a polite flame. It burns with hunger. It burns with patience. And once it found oxygen in those old tunnels, it began to move. Slowly at first, then steadily, then relentlessly. The first signs were small. A smell in the air, a wisp of smoke rising from a hillside. People thought little of it. Mine fires happen, after all. The state sent engineers. They offered solutions. They tried to choke the fire out with clay barriers. They tried to flood it. They tried to carve trenches to stop its spread. But you can't smother a monster you don't understand. And beneath Centralia, the coal seam stretched farther than anyone realized. The fire slipped past every barrier. It deepened. It widened. It crawled under streets and houses, quiet as a sleeping breath. Some days, the smoke rose gently. Other days, the earth burped out fumes so acrid they could make your eyes water. People noticed the sidewalks getting warm. Grass died in patches. He's worse. The smell of sulfur drifted through the air between breezes. Animals reacted first. Birds veered away from steaming ground. Dogs avoided certain yards. Cats hissed at invisible heat rising from beneath the soil. But nobody imagined, not yet, that the fire would consume the entire town. Then came the sickness. Carbon monoxide, silent, invisible, deadly, rose up through basements and gaps in the earth. Residents woke dizzy, lightheaded, weak. People collapsed without warning. One man nearly died in his own home before a state worker discovered toxic gas levels rising through his basement. Centralia was becoming unlivable, slowly, silently, and without mercy. And then came the moment that sealed the town's fate. It was Valentine's Day weekend, 1981. A 12-year-old boy named Todd was playing in his grandmother's backyard when the ground suddenly split open beneath him. Not a crack, not a dip, a sinkhole, a deep, smoking chasm that dropped more than 100 feet straight down into the burning maze below. He clawed at the loose dirt, slipping toward the heat, the fumes rising around him, and if not for a cousin quick enough to pull him out, Centralia would have claimed its first child. That story raced across Pennsylvania like a scream. Newspapers printed it. TV stations reported it. The world finally saw what residents had been living with for years. The ground beneath Centralia was not just unstable, it was lethal. After that, there was no going back. The federal government recommended evacuation. Many resisted. Some refused outright. These were their homes, their streets, their memories. The town was older than the fire. It deserved a chance. But the fire didn't care. It expanded underneath the streets, even as houses above were boarded up and demolished one by one. Block by block, Centralia disappeared. Homeowners accepted buyouts. Old friends said bittersweet goodbyes. The church bells that had once rung over a bustling coal town now echoed over empty streets and fields of growing weeds. Entire neighborhoods vanished, leaving sidewalks leading nowhere, street signs pointing to empty grass. And yet, a handful of residents refused to leave. They became known as the holdouts, people who believed the danger was exaggerated, or that the fire had moved away from their homes, or that no government had the right to force them out. They stayed even after the post office closed and the zip code was canceled, even after their neighbors left, even after houses around them were demolished. They stayed because Centralia wasn't just a place to them, it was identity. It was memory. Today, only a few of them remain. They live in a place that is no longer a town, legally or socially. Centralia has been erased from official maps, but the land beneath them still burns. Scientists estimate that the fire could continue for another century or more, and in that void between the living residents and the smoldering earth legends have taken root. People say you can hear voices in the smoke. They say the ground moans on quiet nights. They say shadowy figures drift through the fog rising from the vents. Some claim these are the souls of miners lost long ago, calling out from the burning tunnels deep underground. Others say it's the fire itself, a living thing, breathing. Most of these stories are fiction, but the truth is eerie enough, because in Centralia, the ground is alive. It shifts, it exhales. It heats the air from below in the middle of winter. It turns earth into ash without flame. In places, the temperature just below the soil reaches hundreds of degrees. In some cracks, you can still see smoke rising, decades later. What remains of the town is surreal. Roads that buckle and twist from underground heat, empty lots where homes once stood, a cemetery perched above an inferno, nature taking over the spaces where people once lived. Only the church remains active, standing proudly on the hill. And every Sunday, as it has for decades, the priest steps inside and holds Mass. For a congregation small in number but immense in resilience, it's one of the strangest scenes in America, a house of worship standing above a fire that has burned for generations. Centralia is often described as a ghost town, but the truth is more haunting. Centralia is a ghost of itself, a town that died slowly, not from violence or abandonment, but from something unstoppable and invisible, burning beneath its foundations. A reminder that the earth beneath us is not always solid, not always safe, not always willing to be tamed. People ask if Centralia is cursed. Others wonder if it's haunted, but the real answer is simpler and far more unsettling. Centralia is what happens when human plans meet the ancient, indifferent power of the earth. A fire began where no one expected it, and once the ground caught flame, there was nothing anyone could do. The residents left. The maps erased the town. The government removed the buildings. But the fire remained. Still burning, still consuming, still alive, And somewhere under the empty streets, deep in the tunnels where miners once swung pickaxes by lantern light, the fire breathes and waits and burns. A town lost to time, a fire older than memory, a warning carved into the bones of Pennsylvania itself. Centralia is not haunted by ghosts, it is haunted by what truly happened. They moved into the duplex because they needed a roof and a place to put their furniture. That is how most ordinary tragedies begin, not with intent or prophecy, but with a practical decision in a season of necessity. Jack and Janet Smurl were not searching for headlines or the kind of notoriety that would later follow them. They were searching for a home. What they found instead was an accumulation of small, inexplicable disturbances that grew slowly, insistently, until ordinary life reorganized itself around fear. At first, the disturbances were almost laughable. A toilet that flushed on its own. A clock stopped at the same minute each week. A smell that appeared and hung like a shadow that refused to leave. Those are the kind of household annoyances that neighbors trade recipes for and then forget. But when these annoyances accumulate inside a single family's life, they stop being anecdotes and become a pattern. The Smurls describe the early years as nights threaded with tiny alarms, a knocking from inside a wall, a mattress that shook, though no one slept on it, a dog thrown against baseboards by an unseen shove. It was the pattern, the persistence, that altered their living room into a place you could no longer take for granted. People ask where belief begins in cases like this. When does reasonable skepticism yield to real dread? In the Smurl home, it happened in stages. First, there was worry, the practical worry of old houses and failing utilities. Then there was irritation, the family arguing about misplaced keys and blamed children. Then, slowly, the irritation hardened into fear when the events exceeded. Plausible explanation, voices in rooms with no speaker, scratches on bodies no one could account for. Something heavy dropped at the foot of a bed with enough force to bruise flesh. The family spoke of feeling watched, of developing a vocabulary to describe the things that had been happening for so long, the language itself grew brittle. When a person tells of being touched by a force that leaves a bruise, the immediate impulse in a rational mind is to look for a human hand. The Smurls repeatedly invited that scrutiny. Police records show interviews, investigators note contradictions, and the public record contains the kinds of details skeptics seize upon, changes in testimony, gaps in chronology. And yet, these mundane checks only ever dampen part of the narrative, because the Smurls were not, as a family, theatrical people. They were tired, and the exhaustion carried itself into the way they told the story, low, spare, and stubbornly sincere. People who know about long-term fear often describe it the same way, not a single meteor strike, but the slow erosion of trust in your home's very boundaries. The case changed shape when the Smurls called for help that could not be paid for with money, help that responds to spiritual vocabulary. They invited priests. They contacted investigators of the paranormal. And the name that turns up in every telling is one that has become notorious in American ghost lore, Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens, who led an office in Connecticut devoted to demonology and paranormal research, were among those who visited the Smurl residence during the 1980s. Their involvement did not merely add an expert opinion, it transformed a private nightmare into a story with national traction. The Warrens, already famous for other high-profile cases, brought publicity, photographs, and a language of malevolence that fit well into the media appetite of the time. Once the Warrens stepped into a case, the machinery of modern folklore engaged. Local reporters arrived. Television crews camped in driveways. A book followed, and later a made-for-TV dramatization that recast private memory into the grammar of entertainment. The public, unused to thinking about ordinary houses as battlegrounds between good and evil, found in the Smurl account a ready narrative, a family besieged by a demon, priests performing rites, furniture levitating and mattresses shaking as if gripped by invisible hands. The story fit a pattern audiences had learned to accept: escalation, intervention, testimony. It fed a hunger for the uncanny and made the home into a theater. But public spectacle is a poor substitute for lived terror. The Smurl family's descriptions were often less cinematic than they were weary. Janet Smurl described nights when she could scarcely sleep because of the weight of what happened in the dark, footsteps pacing above the bedrooms, the sense of breath on the back of her neck when no one was there, the kind of persistent, everyday terror that reshapes the simplest decisions. Do we sleep in the basement or the bedroom? Do we eat dinner together or separate? The Warrens' presence complicated things further because official religious actors were divided on how to proceed. Some priests blessed the house and saw nothing. Others supported the Smurls' claims and offered rites intended to expel whatever force might be present. That division between clergy who reported nothing and families who insisted on suffering produced an ambiguity that would flavor the story forever. Consider the human cost. Imagine, for a moment, a family made into public property by their own suffering. Imagine reporters asking questions about the most private moments of your life while your children sit in the next room. The Smurls spoke, in interviews, of being exhausted not only by midnight disturbances, but by the glare of curiosity and the cruelty of scoffing. Their house became a stage. Their trauma became commodified. And the strain of being both vulnerable and visible multiplied their pain. The family later published a memoir part defense, part explanation, cannot be read only as an attempt to capitalize on attention. It is also an attempt to seize narrative authority, to offer their own words before someone else rewrites them. Skeptics, of course, offered other frameworks. They pointed to contradictions and incentives. They referenced other families whose stories, when scrutinized, unraveled into domestic strife and clever publicity. Psychological explanations, mass hysteria, sleep paralysis, shared delusion were suggested. Some investigators argued that the Smurl account conformed too perfectly to existing folkloric templates. Others argued the opposite, claiming its persistence over time made fraud unlikely. The back and forth became an argument less about fact than about the ethics of belief. When someone tells you their home is not safe, how do you balance doubt with compassion? Crucially, the Smurl narrative does not exist in a vacuum. It sits in a cultural moment when America was unusually eager to believe in unseen enemies and spiritual warfare. The late 20th century in the United States was a time of televangelists and true crime sensationalism, of paperback books and talk shows that fed on the dramatic. The Warrens, for all their controversy, operated brilliantly within this ecology. They were skilled at translating the private drama of a family into a public myth that could be heard on the radio and seen on television. That translation process mattered enormously. It meant the Smurl house was no longer just their home, but part of a larger archive of haunted houses curated by the paranormal industry. And so the Smurl story proliferated: magazine articles, late-night talk segments, trips to book signings. The tale was dramatized in a television movie that emphasized the supernatural elements, compressing years of fear into a screen-ready hour and a half. When a story becomes dramatized, it acquires new life but also new distance from the facts. Actors portray emotions, scripts condense contradictions, and viewers begin to remember the performance as much as the testimony. For the Smurls, whose lived reality included ongoing fear and the occasional ostracism of neighbors, this transformation was ambivalent: validation on one hand and commodified grief on the other. Time, which does not heal all wounds, did something else. It complicated memory. People's recollection shifted, details blurred, the family's account and the public's version diverged in places. Mother's statements from the 1980s read slightly differently against interviews conducted decades later. That inconsistency was seized upon by critics as evidence of fabrication. But those who study long-term trauma know memory is malleable, shaped by stress, suggestion, and repetition. When you are asked to recall the same frightening night 50 times for different reporters, the story inevitably accrues new contours. The problem for believers and skeptics alike is that memory is both evidence and a process, and in the Smurl case, that process was entangled with commerce. There were moments, though, that resisted elegant explanation. The family reported bruises with patterns that seemed inconsistent with accidental injury. Photographs taken during investigations showed anomalies that some claimed were artifacts of film and others insisted were signs. The more formal church investigations, where priests and ministers spent nights in the house, produced uneven results. Some clergy reported nothing that suggested a demonic presence. Others recorded experiences that they could not readily dismiss. That mixed testimony is part of the reason the Smurl case continues to fascinate. It refuses to be resolved into either a neat fraud or a plainly supernatural event. Perhaps the most enduring feature of the Smurl story is its human residue. Laurie and Jetta, Jack's partner in those later retellings, remained people whose lives had been interrupted in intractable ways. Family relationships were strained. Children who grew up with the notoriety had to navigate a complicated social world. Jack Smurl, over time, became something of a public figure in his own right. His later years were spent defending the authenticity of his family's experience in interviews and public appearances. When he died in 2017, the obituaries, predictably, recycled the same mixture of belief and skepticism that had defined the story for decades. Some mourned a man who had been vindicated. Others recalled a figure of controversy. Regardless, his death did not resolve the core question that had shadowed his family's life. What, exactly, lived in that house? The cultural afterlife of the Smurl tale is instructive. As with any durable story, different groups use it to say different things. For some religious readers, it is an object lesson in spiritual warfare and the need for vigilance. For skeptics, it is a case study in how narrative markets manufacture belief. For students of folklore, it is a live laboratory where modern myth-making and the anxieties of a particular era are visible. Each reading tells us more about the reader than about the original events. That reflexivity, the way the story reveals its own retellers, is a large part of its power. In the end, if you listen to the Smurl story closely, you hear not only claims of furniture levitation and teeth marks, but the quieter sound of exhaustion, the tired voice of a wife and mother testifying to what she could not dismiss, the shaky admission of a father who felt his house slipping away into something he could not name. The real heart of the case is not whether the world contains demons, but whether the rest of us can hold a family's testimony with enough generosity to be useful. When someone says their home is unsafe, the immediate moral obligation is not to produce a counter-theory, but to tend to the vulnerability disclosed. That is why the Smurl narrative will not die. Not because there is definitive proof withheld in an attic or an undiscovered tape, but because it arranges elemental human fears into a tidy story. The private invaded, the sacred desecrated, a family forced to choose between privacy and publicity. We retell it because it provides a figured space in which to negotiate our anxieties about faith, about the limits of skepticism, about the media's appetite for spectacle. So when you sit down and listen to the Smurl account, allow yourself to hold more than one posture at once. You can be skeptical and sympathetic. You can demand evidence and also acknowledge the cruelty of being publicly disbelieved. Remember that behind every sensational headline, there are people whose nights are shorter and whose days are filled with the residue of fear. Whether or not the house on Chase Street had a demon in it, something real happened there. A family's life was altered irrevocably, and the cost of that alteration is not reparable by opinion columns or documentary specials. And if you still want to ask whether something like a demon exists, that is a question this story will always leave on the table. It will not answer it, but it will press you to consider the larger question: how do we respond when someone says they are afraid in the place they should be safest, their own home? The answer to that is less supernatural than the case itself, and perhaps more important. There are stories that linger not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. Stories where the silence grows heavier with each passing year, where answers harden into absence, and where a single moment, one brief, ordinary moment, unravels an entire lifetime. The disappearance of 8-year-old Cherrie Ann Mahan from Cabot, Pennsylvania, is one of those stories. A case that begins with a school bus stopping on a cold Friday afternoon in 1985 and ends with a mystery that still has no name, no closure, and no final chapter. It was February 22nd, a late winter day in Butler County, when the yellow school bus rumbled down the familiar rural road toward the hill that led to the Mahan home. For the children riding inside, it was a day like any other school. Chatter, backpacks slung carelessly across seats. But for one child, those final minutes on the bus would become the dividing line between before and after, between presence and disappearance. Cherrie Mahan, with her hazel eyes and bright smile, stepped off the bus along with several other children at around 4 p.m. Her home stood only a short walk up the driveway, a distance so small that most parents would never think twice about it. Her mother, Janice, had even come down the hill to watch her daughter arrive. Cherrie waved, like she always did. She had no fear, no reason to hurry, no sense that anything was wrong. But the moment she set foot on that rural road, something happened that no one saw clearly enough to explain. And within minutes, a child who should have been walking toward her mother was simply gone. When Janice returned to the house and realized Cherrie hadn't followed, she walked back down the driveway. But the snow showed no footprints. But there was no path leading home, no suggestion that her daughter had veered off the road. Instead, there were tire tracks near the mailbox, tracks that hadn't been there earlier. One of the other children remembered a distinctive van parked along the rural road that afternoon. It was large, blue or green, with a mural on the side showing a skier on a snowy mountain. A detail so unusual that it stuck in their mind instantly. That van would become the single most haunting image in the case, a moving ghost that would dominate headlines, witness statements, and the fears of an entire community. A van that, to this day, has never been found. When police arrived, the urgency was immediate. Rural kidnappings are rare. Child disappearances in broad daylight, in plain view of neighbors, almost unheard of. And yet, here they were, a silent road, no footprints, no signs of a struggle, no dropped backpack or mitten to mark the final spot where a child once stood. The search that followed was enormous. Helicopters swept the woods. Volunteers combed through brush and fields with flashlights and dogs. Neighbors yelled her name for hours into the cold wind. But there was nothing, no clothing, no clues, no sound, no trace. The earth itself seemed to swallow her, leaving behind a road, a driveway, some tire impressions, and a mother screaming her daughter's name into a world that refused to answer. What makes this case uniquely devastating is how quickly the search for Cherrie expanded far beyond Cabot. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children launched a new program shortly after her disappearance, mass-distributed mailers featuring missing children. And Cherrie became the very first face printed on those postcards that arrived daily in millions of American homes. Her picture on cereal boxes, electric bills, envelopes, mailers, her smile carried across the entire country, crossing state lines and arriving in mailboxes of strangers who had never heard of Cabot, Pennsylvania. For many, she was the first missing child they ever saw printed in their hands. But with the new attention came new pain. Tips poured in from dozens of states. People thought they saw a child who resembled her in stores, malls, parks, roadside stops. But every lead ended in nothing. The van was reported in multiple regions, but its trail evaporated each time investigators approached. Authorities came to believe that whoever took Cherrie acted fast, planned it, watched the route, knew the timing, possibly knew the family. That is the part that twists deepest for her mother, the suggestion that someone familiar with their lives was waiting on that cold afternoon. Janice Mahan, overwhelmed by the swarm of investigators, reporters, and strangers knocking on her door, said something early in the investigation that has echoed for decades. It's like she was lifted off the face of the earth. As the weeks turned into years, the case morphed into something colder, heavier. Birthdays passed. Each February brought memory instead of celebration. Forensic sketches attempted to age progress. Cherrie's face, a imagining the girl she would have grown into. Janice taped them beside the originals. For her, they were not hypothetical images. They were possibilities, hopes, futures not yet erased. But hope is a fragile thing in cases like this. It collapses easily when the world stops cooperating. Over the next 3 decades, the Mahan case gained periodic bursts of attention and heartbreak. People called in tips claiming they'd seen a woman who looked like Cherrie. Some claimed to be Cherrie. Others offered detailed but unverifiable descriptions of her fate. For every lead, Janice waited. For every rumor, she prepared herself. And most of the time, the news was the same: another dead end, another false hope. At one point, investigators followed up on a tip that a woman from Michigan believed she might be Cherrie. DNA ruled it out. Another time, a letter arrived claiming to know where Cherrie was buried. Police dug. They investigated. They searched. Nothing was found, but the cruelty didn't stop there. Social media brought a new wave of hoaxes, people fabricating stories for attention, inserting themselves into the narrative of a hurt family. Each fake message reopened the wound. Janice said the worst part was not the silence, it was the noise. False leads were emotional violence disguised as hope. Still, the case remained open. Still, police insisted they would not give up. Still, the community remembered. The driveway where she vanished became a symbol in its own right, a short stretch of cold ground that represented a mother's worst nightmare. As years turned to decades, investigators began publicly acknowledging what they had quietly believed for years. Cherrie had likely been abducted by someone who planned it, someone who knew her routine, someone with intent. The possibility of random stranger kidnapping still existed, but the remoteness of the road suggested something more deliberate. The blue van mural remained the most haunting evidence. Witnesses never wavered in their description: a skier descending a snowy mountain. It sounded almost harmless, almost whimsical. But that imagery would replay in Janice's mind endlessly. She said that whenever she saw paintings or winter scenes, her daughter's face would float into memory again. But the mystery persisted. No arrests, no remains, no confirmed sightings. No closure. And time did the cruelest work of all, turning the unknown into something that felt permanent. The disappearance of a child leaves 2 parallel worlds behind. The first is the world before, where routines held steady, where mornings were predictable, where a mother knew when the school bus would arrive each day. The second is the world after, where every sound becomes a threat, where every hour is grief stretched thin, where the smallest memory becomes both a comfort and a torment. For Janice, that division is the boundary of her life. She never stopped searching, never stopped answering calls, never stopped talking to police. Every once in a while, she hears from someone who swears they know something. But leads fade, and reality returns, heavy and unyielding. Cherrie's room was preserved for years, a quiet space where childhood froze in place, a reminder, a shrine, an anchor against forgetting. In the community, her name became a symbol, one that parents would whisper when they warned their children to stay close on winter afternoons. Teachers invoked her as a reminder of vigilance. The town would gather for anniversaries, lighting candles, sharing prayers, whispering memories. But in the end, the story returns to that driveway, that stretch of snow, those tire tracks, that van, that moment where afternoon sunlight touched the road, and then everything went dark. This case remains unsolved, not because it is ignored, but because it is incomplete. Silence here is not closure, it is a void. And that void is where the fear lives. The fear that someone out there knows what happened. The fear that the truth is buried not in the woods or the fields, but in someone's memory, someone who never came forward. Cherrie would be an adult now. She would have had a life that branched into jobs, relationships, dreams. Instead, she is frozen in time, 8 years old forever, stepping off a bus into a Pennsylvania winter, disappearing into a mystery that has defined not only her family, but her town. Every February, Janice still marks the anniversary. She speaks at events. She lights candles. She reminds the world that a mother's search does not end simply because the years grow heavier. And in every statement, every interview, Every memorial vigil, she says the same thing: my daughter is still out there somewhere, and I want her home. In the end, Cherrie Mahan's story is not just the tale of a disappearance. It is the story of a mother's endurance, a community's heartbreak, and a mystery that refuses to be forgotten. The driveway remains, the memories remain, and so does the question, unanswered, unyielding, and echoing across nearly 4 decades. Where is Cherrie Mahan? There are cases that frighten us because of what they suggest, and cases that frighten us because of what they reveal. This is one of the latter. A story so bizarre, so grotesque, and so profoundly unsettling that investigators still struggle to categorize it. A story with almost no beginning, no visible middle, and, even now, no ending. This is the true, chilling account of the economy, Jane Doe, the embalmed human head found in the woods of Beaver County, Pennsylvania. A head without a name, a crime without a suspect, and a mystery so strange that even seasoned forensic investigators still call it one of the most disturbing cases they've ever encountered. Our story begins on a cold December afternoon in 2014. A teenage boy was walking through the woods near Mason Road in Economy Borough, a quiet, suburban, rural community where deer and stray branches are the only things you expect to find beneath the winter canopy. The boy wasn't looking for anything unusual. He was just walking, passing time, the way kids do. But then he stopped. Something caught his eye. A strange object lying in a patch of leaves, too pale, too round, too wrong to ignore. He stepped closer, and the moment he understood what he was looking at, the world around him froze in place. It was a human head, not a skull, not remains buried by time, not an animal carcass misidentified. A freshly severed, totally intact, fully embalmed human head placed deliberately on the ground, as if waiting to be discovered. The boy ran. The call to 911 came, and within minutes, police were moving quietly into the woods, unsure whether they were walking into a homicide scene, a dumping ground, or something far stranger. As they approached the object, the truth took shape beneath the fading winter light. It was the head of a woman elderly, with gray hair that had been washed, curled, and styled. Her skin had the waxy sheen of someone professionally prepared for a funeral viewing. Her lips were parted slightly. The features were intact. The cut at the neck was clean on the inside and jagged on the outside, as if someone with anatomical knowledge had removed the interior structures first, then taken a saw to the outer tissue. And then investigators made a discovery that turned this from a disturbing case into a nightmare. The woman had no eyeballs. Her eyelids were closed, and beneath them were mortuary eye caps, small plastic discs used in embalming to keep the eyelids from collapsing. But instead of eyes, someone had placed 2 bright red rubber balls into the sockets, toys, plastic spheres like the kind you might find in a vending machine or a cheap novelty pack. No embalmer would ever use them, no funeral home recognized them, and no one, no matter how strange the motive, could explain why they were there. Immediately, investigators realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary crime scene. This was something different, methodical, prepared, ritualistic, but not in any way that matched known patterns of occult activity. It was both too precise and too senseless. The head had been preserved, embalmed, styled, prepared, then severed, and abandoned in a place where a child would find it. The woman appeared to be between her late 60s and early 80s. She had undergone extensive dental work, many fillings, almost every tooth showing signs of long-term treatment. Her hair was silver gray, curled in a soft, elderly style. Toxicology results showed traces of medications consistent with heart disease. She likely died of natural causes. But someone, somewhere between her death and her burial, decided to remove her head. And that is when investigators asked the question that still hangs over the case today: why? The more they dug, the more disturbing the possibilities became. First, they considered murder, but no blood, no signs of violence, and the presence of embalming fluid ruled that out. She was already dead when her head was taken. Next, they looked at medical institutions, anatomy labs, teaching hospitals, mortuary schools, but none were missing a head and none recognized the face. Then they looked into the darker corners of the anatomy trade, the unregulated, underground industry of body brokers. Cadavers donated for scientific research are often dismembered and sold in parts. Heads are used for dental study, limbs for surgical practice, torsos for classroom dissection. In legitimate channels, these parts are tracked. In illegitimate ones, they are not. But even in the shadows of the cadaver trade, no one had ever heard of something like this. A fully embalmed head, cosmetically prepared, abandoned in the woods. If someone stole her head, why leave it where it would be found? Why place it neatly? Why the toy eyeballs? Why no body? Forensic anthropologists ran isotope tests on her teeth and hair. These tests can sometimes map the regions a person lived based on minerals absorbed in diet and water. Results suggested she may have lived in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, or upstate New York in the last months of her life. A wide range, too wide for a clean lead. Investigators then checked missing persons databases. Hundreds of elderly women matched the rough age. None of them matched her. They checked death records, mortuaries, crematoriums, funeral homes. They asked, who prepared this woman's body? Who embalmed her? Who styled her hair? Who placed the caps in her eyes? But no funeral home claimed her. No cemetery reported a disturbance. No morgue was missing a cadaver. It was as if she came from nowhere. The more investigators learned, the more the facts refused to align. Everything about her said prepped for a showing. Everything about her disposal said someone did not care if she was recognized. And the red rubber balls remained the single most chilling clue. Rubber balls do not belong in human remains. They do not appear in embalming manuals. Funeral directors said it was bizarre, impossible, and offensive. Some wondered if it was symbolic. Others thought it was mockery. A few believed it was meant to disguise the fact that the eyes had been removed. But the truth is, nobody knows. This head exists outside the logic of normal crime. It does not behave like a murder. It does not behave like a burial. It does not behave like a trafficking operation. It behaves like a message. A message no one has been able to translate. As months turned to years, the case became colder but never closed. Investigators nicknamed her Economy Jane Doe, though some privately called her the Woman in the Woods. Her story re-entered the spotlight when unsolved mysteries covered the case. Viewers were horrified. Veterans of forensic science said they had never seen anything like it. Ordinary people wondered if it was a cult, a body broker cover-up, a disgruntled employee making a statement, a deranged mortician, a medical student acting out. The theories spiraled, but none explained every element, especially not the eyes. 10 years passed. No name, no suspects, no matching dental records. No DNA embalming chemicals had destroyed it, and that might be the cruelest twist of all. Embalming preserves the outside and annihilates the inside. It kept her face recognizable, while erasing the clues that could have revealed her identity. Whoever did this, whether intentionally or not, made her a mystery from the moment they opened her chest cavity and replaced her fluids with chemicals. Economy. Jane Doe became a symbol of every unsolved case that begins with a single horrific discovery and dissolves into silence. Her head spent days or weeks alone in the woods before the boy found her, alone, exposed to the winter, staring, if the word can be used, upward through eyelids supported by plastic discs and filled with rubber spheres. Some investigators believe she was placed as a message to funeral homes or body brokers, a warning, a middle finger to the system, a demonstration. Others believe the person responsible wanted recognition, wanted the case to become notorious, wanted the world to see their handiwork. And some still think the simplest explanation may be true. Someone stole her head, panicked, and dumped it. But if panic was the motive, why the placement? Why choose a spot visible from the road? Why adjust her hair? Why pose her? This did not feel like panic, it felt like intention. Today, the woods off Mason Road look ordinary, peaceful, quiet. If you walked past the exact spot where she was found, you wouldn't know anything horrific had ever happened there. But for those who know the story, the ground has its own gravity, a pull, a reminder that not every mystery offers even the courtesy of a beginning. In interviews, detectives still talk about her with a mixture of frustration and sorrow. They want to give her a name. They want to tell her family, wherever they are, what became of her. They want to close the case. They want to close the case. But until someone comes forward, until a relative recognizes her photograph, until a mortician admits a terrible mistake, until a whistleblower speaks, until a death record finally aligns, she remains anonymous. A woman with decades of life behind her, reduced to a single horrifying discovery. A life with no memories preserved publicly, a story with no middle, a death with no explanation. And a family somewhere who may still wonder what happened to the woman they buried or thought they buried. If someone who loved her is still alive, they don't know the truth. They don't know her body was disturbed. They don't know her head was taken. They don't know her final resting place was not a grave, but the cold earth beside Mason Road. The case of economy, Jane Doe, is not simply a mystery. It is a wound in the forensic world, a wound in a family that may never realize the truth, a wound in a community that still shudders when the story resurfaces. There is one thing investigators repeat whenever they speak of her. She has a name. She belongs to somebody. And somebody out there knows her. Her face preserved, styled, and abandoned still waits for recognition. And until that moment comes, she remains what she was the day she was found, a question placed gently in the woods. A silent message no one has deciphered. A woman whose story ended far from where it began. A mystery staring back through closed eyelids and red plastic eyes. Some tragedies feel like sudden storms, violent, abrupt, impossible to see coming. Others move slowly, like a bruise spreading beneath the skin. They start with whispers, lingering resentments, small cruelties that build silently until something breaks. The murder of 16-year-old Laurie Show in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, is one of those stories. A story where teenage jealousy evolved into obsession, where cruelty escalated into violence, and where a single morning forever divided the life of a family into before and after. This is not just a story of murder. It is a story of warnings ignored, manipulation disguised as teenage drama, and a mother who walked into a nightmare she could never forget. Lorie Show was the kind of girl people described as gentle. Not quite exactly, but soft-spoken, someone who carried kindness like a second skin. She lived with her mother, Hazel, in a modest apartment in East Lampeter Township. Lorie struggled sometimes with anxiety, but she was close with her mother, open with her, trusting. She told Hazel everything, what worried her, who she liked, and who frightened her. And one person frightened her deeply. Her name was Lisa Michelle Lambert. Lambert was older, aggressive, volatile, and already known for having a temper that turned sharp quickly. She was pregnant at the time. Her relationship with a young man named Lawrence Butch Yunkin was unstable, and Lorie had once had a brief, awkward encounter with him that Lambert became fixated on. Fixated is almost too soft a word. She developed an obsession, one rooted not in truth, but in insecurity. To Lambert, Lorie became a symbol of betrayal, of humiliation, of something she could not control. It began with phone calls. Threats whispered and shouted, insults thrown like knives. Lorie tried to avoid Lambert at school, but Lambert always found a way to appear, near her locker, in hallways, near classrooms. The words were cruel, sharp, personal, and Lorie, frightened, told her mother. Hazel took immediate action. She contacted the school. She confronted Lambert. She tried to protect her daughter. But teenage conflict, in the eyes of adults, often looks smaller than it really is. And nobody, not teachers, not administrators, saw how dark the situation already was becoming. What we now know is that Lambert's resentment was growing into something obsessive. She kept journals filled with rage. She bragged to friends about scaring Lorie. She spoke openly about wanting to hurt her, and in her toxic relationship with Yunkin, cruelty and paranoia fed off each other. In one confrontation, Lambert threatened Lorie with violence. Lorie told her mother she feared she would be hurt, so Hazel listened. She intervened again, but Lambert was already imagining a world where removing Lorie would solve her insecurities. And imagination, mixed with jealousy, mixed with a desire for control, became the perfect storm for violence. The night before the murder, Lorie told her mother she didn't feel safe. She didn't want to be alone. She told her daughter she would meet with the school the next morning, speak to someone, escalate the situation, get help. She reminded Lorie that she was not alone, that she was loved, that she would be protected. But protection is only possible when danger plays by the rules. And the danger in this case had already stepped outside of them. The next morning, Friday, December 20th, 1991, Hazel left early for the school meeting. She didn't want to wake Lorie too abruptly, so she whispered a promise that she would be back soon, kissed her daughter gently, and stepped out the door. Lorie was supposed to meet her later. Hazel never imagined those words would be the last she'd say to her daughter. While Hazel was at the school, Lambert, Yunkin, and another teenage girl named Tabitha Buck traveled to the show residence. Lambert had manipulated both of them into believing this was going to be a confrontation, one where Lorie would apologize, be humiliated, or be threatened. But that was never Lambert's true intention. She had planned something else entirely. They got inside the apartment through deception. They walked down the hallway where Lorie would have been getting ready. And inside that quiet, ordinary suburban apartment, everything descended into violence. What happened next is a reconstruction from testimony, forensic evidence, and statements made over years of appeals and trials. Lorie tried to flee. She tried to reason. She tried to defend herself. But Lambert's rage was overwhelming. Words turned into screams. Screams turned into a struggle. Violence erupted in the closed space of the bedroom. Lorie's throat was slashed multiple times. She was stabbed. She was beaten. And when Lambert finally stepped away from the scene, Lorie was dying alone, terrified and still trying to breathe. Moments after Lambert fled, Hazel returned home. She opened the door, expecting silence, maybe a sleepy daughter. Instead, she heard something, a faint sound, a horrible gasp. She followed it. And what she found will haunt anyone who hears this story. Lorie was still alive, barely, on the floor of her bedroom, bleeding, struggling to speak. Her eyes were wide with fear. Her hands reached for her mother in desperation. Hazel ran to her, lifted her, held her. Lorie tried to say something, tried to tell her mother who did this, tried to say Lambert's name, but the words came out in broken fragments. Hazel screamed for help, screamed words that tore open the quiet morning, but by the time help arrived, Lorie was gone. Hazel held her daughter as she died. That is the detail that remains carved into every telling of this case. A mother holding her child, feeling life slip away, unable to do anything except feel the warmth leave her arms. No parent recovers from that. There is no healing, only surviving. The investigation moved fast because the brutality was unmistakable. Suspicion immediately fell on Lambert. Witnesses came forward. Students whispered about threats. Friends of Lambert repeated the things she had said. The alibis fell apart. Yunkin confessed to being part of the attack. Buck admitted her involvement. Lambert tried to push the blame onto both of them, insisting she only wanted to scare Lorie, not kill her. But the crime scene told its own truth. Lorie's wounds reflected rage, intimate, personal rage. Lambert was charged with first-degree murder, Yunkin with third-degree murder. Buck with second-degree murder. The trial was explosive. Lambert, dramatic and manipulative, tried to control the narrative. She claimed abuse. She claimed coercion. She told story after story, each one shifting depending on what might serve her best. But evidence is a stubborn thing. And the evidence showed that Lambert was not simply involved. She was the driving force, the architect, the spark, the knife. She was convicted, sentenced to life in prison. Buck was convicted. Youngkin was convicted. And Laurie's name became etched permanently into Lancaster's history. But the story didn't end there. Years later, Lambert tried to reinvent herself. She claimed she was wrongfully convicted. She said the police framed her. She accused investigators of misconduct. Her claims made headlines. Her appeals went through courts multiple times. But each time the truth resurfaced, Laurie had told people she feared Lambert. Lambert had made threats. And the forensic evidence matched the original conclusion. The courts upheld her conviction more than once. Still, controversies kept the case alive in the media. And each time it resurfaced, Hazel had to relive that morning all over again. But through it all, Hazel remained steady, determined, strong. She attended every hearing. She defended her daughter's memory. She refused to let Laurie's name be twisted for the sake of someone else's narrative. And eventually, society's attention moved on. But Hazel's didn't. A mother's grief doesn't expire. It doesn't fade. It becomes part of the air she breathes. Laurie's room remained untouched for years. Her photographs lined the walls. Hazel carried her daughter's memory like a wound and a mission. She dedicated herself to speaking about teen violence, about recognizing the signs of obsession, about trusting your children when they say they're afraid. Because Laurie tried to tell the world she was in danger, and the world did not act fast enough. Today, the story of Lorie Show stands as one of Pennsylvania's most chilling and heartbreaking crimes, not because it is gory or sensational, but because it was preventable. Because the warning signs were there. Because adults underestimated the intensity of a teenage girl's rage. Because nobody imagined the jealousy. Jealousy of a 16-year-old could mutate into murder. Laurie never got to grow up. She never got to graduate, never got to pursue her dreams, never got to see the possibilities her life held. Her final moments were full of fear, but her life, every day before that, was full of love. When people speak her name today, it is with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. Because Lorie Show did not die in vain. Her story continues to warn parents and teenagers that danger sometimes comes not from strangers, but from the familiar faces we underestimate. It teaches us that cruelty can escalate without warning, that young people can commit acts beyond adult imagination, and that the ugliest violence often grows in silence long before it erupts in reality. Laurie's life was short, her death was brutal, but her story remains. A reminder that we must listen, protect, and act long before the spiral of jealousy and obsession reaches the point of no return. Lorie Show will forever be 16 years old, a girl with a gentle voice, a girl who trusted easily, a girl whose name echoes through Pennsylvania as both a warning and a legacy. Her story ends in tragedy, but it lives on in the heart she touched, in the lessons learned, and in the voice of a mother who refuses to let her daughter be forgotten.